Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking another look at functional programming and talking with someone about how to learn functional programming and how to get into it for the first time. Of course, before we get started, a quick thank you to Neximo, who's our sponsor. Neximo provides developers with APIs to let you access and easily incorporate voice, SMS, authentication, and a bunch of other really cool things into your projects or into your products. Find out more about what they do at neximo.com or find them on Twitter and thank them for sponsoring the podcast at @NeximoDev. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. I'm here today with
Abby Sassel.
And Abby, what do you do?
I'm a software engineer and functional programmer.
A functional programmer is so fantastic. Our last guest talked to us about getting into functional programming, sort of getting a first career in it, getting your first job in it. And I think you and I are going to chat about learning some functional programming.
Yeah, sounds great.
Can you tell me a little bit about your work or what you do or what kind of languages you like to work in?
Sure. So at the moment, I'm at a financial technology company that specializes in automating pretty much every aspect or minimizing the manual work involved in the mortgage brokering process. So the company's name is Habito. At the moment, we work with a ton of mortgage experts, but the vast majority of our product revolves around automating the application and mortgage, every stage of the mortgage process with the help of manual mortgage experts.
How very exciting. Our last guest was also talking to us about working in financial services. Do you think that's very common, like a common place where people in functional programming wind up?
I think functional programming is well suited to the financial services simply because a lot of the features of functional programming languages are well suited to industries that require certainty around their application. So to give you an example, functional programming languages might be good, for example, to write a proof system that proves that based on some rules or some logic, on some business logic that you've encoded in your program, the program works to those specifications. Also, you get a certain number if you're working with what's called a typed functional language, which specifies the types of your data. For example, I can define a person data type, which has things like name, age, profession, etc. I can define sort of arbitrarily complex data types and the data structures that work with them, which gives me a lot more certainty over the type of data, for example, the type of input from a user that I might receive, how valid it is, and what functions and what things I can do with that data.
That sounds reasonable enough. I was wondering if we could go ahead and step way, way back and get very, very fundamental, very sort of 101 level with functional programming.
Sure.
What do you mean by functional programming?
Okay, so functional programming, I would consider it to be something that has a basis in mathematics. Functional programming is defining systems and defining programs in terms of computation of mathematical functions. When you look at you look at a simple mathematical equation that takes a number, for example, and increases it, you get a certain level of certainty about that mathematical function that a lot of functional programming languages try to emulate. So one of these things is state management or good state management, and the other is side effect management. So I'll describe the two briefly.
Please.
State management. So to take the original example again, if I have a function that takes a single number and adds one to it or increments it, if my state is managed well, then my function will return exactly the same output for the same input. So I can give it one, and I can give it one 1,000,000 times and run that function 1,000,000 times and expect the same output, which is the number 2, every single time.
Sort of the security and safety of one always being one as long as nothing's gone wrong?
Yes, exactly. So that's an example of good state management in a functional programming language. So to contrast that to something that doesn't have state managed as well or has something called global state, might be, for example, if my function is a stateful function. So an example of a stateful function might be the use of something that generates random numbers.
Okay.
And there are a few reasons why generating random numbers is a stateful function, but it's largely because it requires state in order to be able to do its job, in order to be able to generate random numbers. So by using this more stateful function, if I use that in my +1 function or my incrementing function, if I pass 1 as an input to my incrementing function, but my incrementing function uses something stateful, such as this random number generator. So I might be passing it 1, and it might be adding 1 to the output of this random number generator, for example. So I have no guarantees in this case that the output, given the same input to this function, the output is exactly the same every single time. I could pass this function 1, and it might return me 5 one time, it might return me 1,734 the next time. So I have no guarantees about the state of that particular function.
So it sounds like functional programming either lends you the reassuring stability that you would expect from math and numbers and sort of the world of calculations.
Yeah.
Or it can also deliver you bonkers, exciting, unexpected novelty on the best of days.
Well, I think, so the second example that I described, which is of something that doesn't have state managed well, is the part of the reason of functional programming is it's very hard to do in a functional programming language. Or it's not necessarily that it's hard to do, but you have to explicitly say where you're introducing that kind of statefulness in your application.
You have to actively go out and get some chaos if you want some in functional programming then?
Yeah, precisely. You just have to, it gives you a vocabulary with which to define how you're managing your state. And that means that you still have the certainties around how you manage your data and how you manage your functions, but it's all very explicit.
That makes some sense.
Yeah, if, for example, this incrementing function, which I've just thrown a random number generator into, I would have to specify that in what's called a type signature, which says the type of this takes a number, returns a number, but also, there's this bit of state in the middle of that you then have to handle and that you have to expose to your application. You have to be very, very explicit about how you manage your state. So that's one of the approaches of functional programming. The other is side effect management.
Oh,
an example of side effect management, or poor. I'll start with a poor one because it's easier to illustrate. So an example of poor side effect management might be: I have the same function. Now imagine I've managed my state well, and it's a normal function again. It takes a number and it increments it by 1, and I can reliably reuse the same input and expect the same output. However, in a less functional application which doesn't manage side effects very well, or that has side effects, I might pass 1 into that function and the microwave will turn on.
Yeah.
And there's no indication. There's no indication in my function definition of me turning the microwave on that I should be able to expect some appliances to suddenly turn on. So so that's obviously an extreme example, but a side effect might be something that's not explicitly one of the benefits of functional programming languages that makes it very difficult to introduce side effects into your application, again, without that explicit management and explicitly exposing it as an interface. So that's not to say that you can't involve state in your application, you can't have side effects, but almost the use of it is minimized and the effect of it is minimized, and you need to be very explicit about how you manage them.
More math, less random microwaves?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
I'll take it. So one of the things I love talking about developers with is I love to talk to them about what programming language they're really into and why, and just sort of let them pitch it. And I do believe that you're a Clojurian?
I am a Clojurian. I'm working at the moment professionally with Haskell.
Oh, but your heart belongs to Clojure.
We're definitely involved in Clojure as well, so I can definitely talk a little bit about the
Please. I love how you were very gentle, be like, Haskell's great too.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people have you can kind of have an affinity to one programming language or another. I think everyone has their favorites, but I kind of try to veer away from, okay, well, this is the programming language that I'm going to work with for the rest of my life, or I'm going to work with Clojure for the rest of my life, or Haskell for the rest of my life.
That's a real serious commitment.
Yeah. And I think your requirements will change, and the things that you like about a particular language will change. And I think sometimes there is definitely such a thing as programming language fatigue, in that you get so used to a programming language, you feel like you've learned everything about it, and sometimes it's time to move on. So I enjoy playing about with different, in particular, functional programming languages. If I was going to pick a couple that I really enjoy a lot of the features of, it would be Clojure and it would be Haskell.
So can you talk to me first a little bit about Clojure? What does it feel like? What does it look like? Yeah, can you sell us some Clojure?
Yeah, so Clojure is what people might describe as a Lisp language. And a Lisp language is basically, it uses a lot of parentheses to describe and to shape pretty much all of its syntax and all of its expressions. And what I mean by syntax is almost the grammatical structure and almost like in English or in literature.
So like the grammar of the language, the way it's formed, the weird little things that make up the vocabulary of it.
Precisely.
Yeah, just the living language of the language.
Yeah, precisely. So in Clojure, the syntax involves a lot of parentheses, and there's a certain way of describing an expression or writing an expression. So you start with the function first, and then you follow it up with its arguments. So to give an example of that, again, if I have my incrementing function might start off with open brackets and then a plus symbol and the first argument, which might be the number that I'm passing in that I want to increment, and then 1, because I want to increment it by 1, and then a closed bracket. Yeah. And so that's got 3 things in it that just describe kind of the thing that I want to happen in my function application, or when I apply that function, when I pass it in an argument. Clojure is Lisp language. It's what's called an untyped language. So I don't necessarily, when I described, if I have in my application a person type, for example, in Clojure, I don't have to necessarily define the types that are involved in my person, let's call it a type, but I have a data structure that describes a person. So that has things like name, things like age, things like profession.
So it doesn't necessarily need to know everything you're planning on doing.
I don't necessarily have to specify it, but Clojure is clever enough to infer or to deduce my types from the structure of the input that I give it. So if I say, make me a person, and I pass it a number, let's say 50 for age, I pass it a piece of text that is my name, it will say, okay, well, this person contains information about age, which is a number value, and a name, which is a text value. I don't necessarily have to explicitly define those types. Whereas in another types language, Haskell being one example, I'd have to explicitly say, okay, this is what my person's going to look like before I start to define it, both of which have its pros and cons.
So Haskell sounds a little bit more strict. Haskell, you're probably going to want to have a decent idea of what you're doing as you get started.
Yes, absolutely. And if I'm honest, that's one of the things that I really had to get used to about Haskell coming from Clojure, was that I had to have more of an idea about what I wanted both the inputs and outputs of all of my functions to look like, because I had to describe them almost fully in order to be able to use them. There are some small exceptions to this rule, but largely you kind of have to know what kind of data that you're working with in order to build your application.
It seems like, Haskell might be a really fantastic language to work with if you've got some confidence behind you and you feel ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I know some Haskell developers that would definitely promote Haskell as a beginner language, but if I'm comparing the two quite ruthlessly...
You sound terribly ruthless.
I am...
You're just like, I'm just the nicest voice ever. Oh, comparing the two.
I'm a tiny bit biased, but having come from Clojure as a beginner, I would definitely advocate that as a really good start for beginners to get used to the kind of functional programming, what's called paradigm, or the style of programming that is used in a functional programming language. Yeah, get used to some of the concepts first in Clojure, get used to the syntax, because it is so much simpler. In Clojure, you can describe a function in maybe 1 or 2 ways, whereas in Haskell, by comparison, I would say there are quite a few different ways to do more or less the same thing. So you can do something in a very long-winded way, or you can rewrite it in a way that's a little bit more elegant and a little bit more concise. But it's a steeper learning curve to figure out the best way to write the function and expose and create the software and create the systems that you want to in Haskell.
So let's say hypothetically that I am absolutely sold. I was like, wow, you know what? I was talking to this lady, Abby, and she was fantastic. And she was just like, well, you got to learn Clojure. Where on earth would I start? Okay,
so I would absolutely advocate. There are 3 things. And I think when you're learning any programming language, I think there are a few things that are important. So there are the actual resources like books and, online resources, blog posts and things like that. But I do think that there's a large element of community there, because as soon, you can be going through a book, but as soon as you get stuck, you're probably going to want to ask someone questions about the thing that you're stuck on. I would definitely say one of the resources I would first recommend for a Clojure developer is something called Clojure for the Brave. Now, that's a free online ebook. And if you type in Clojure for the Brave into Google, it should come up as the first result. The reason I recommend that is because it has amazing, really quite simple descriptions of various aspects of and constructs in Clojure. It gives you a nice introduction to the Clojure syntax, but it also has a ton of exercises. So you're starting off with how to create a Clojure function, and then going on to slightly bigger and more advanced concepts. And it really walks you through that, and you can sort of go through at your own pace.
You must have been an absolute delight for teachers. I love how I was like, where do we get started? And you're like, oh, wow, this book has so much homework.
It does. But also, I love homework. I absolutely love homework and just project work and stuff. Like going through and doing exercises really helps solidify the things that I think I know. On the flip side as well, explaining it to other people. When you're learning something, I find it incredibly helpful to actually explain the thing that you're learning once you feel relatively confident with it to someone else. And I definitely find that helps kind of solidify the ideas that you think you know. You almost need to know them like the back of your hand in order to be able to explain them to someone else. And it really helps identify the things where you're a little bit unsure about aspects of the thing you're learning.
And if you're offering to help someone out, they're not really going to get too angry if you're like, wait, hang on, let's look this up.
No, not at all. Absolutely not. That kind of brings me on to, I suppose, the community aspect of the Clojure, which is part of the reason why I would absolutely advocate learning Clojure as a programming beginner, because the community is really, really supportive, and there are lots of resources out there and lots of meetups and groups and online chat boards and things that you can go on to find out more or ask questions if you get stuck. And there's a really welcoming and friendly community. So to give you 2 places to go to, I would absolutely advocate, if you're in London, there's a place called the London Clojurians community, which has things like Google Groups and a Slack channel, like an online message board channel, and they hold meetups. But in general, and I think the sort of global Clojure community describe themselves as Clojurians. Clojure spelled Clojure, and Clojurians is removing the E off on the end and replacing it with IANS. So someone who works with Clojure would be a Clojurian, and I think if you go onto the clojurians.org website, you'll find a whole host of other resources.
So this is a question you may not be able to answer for me, but why Clojurians? Why not Clojurites or... I've got nothing.
I mean, that's probably why. They probably ran out of ideas after Clojurites, I think.
Like moving to the UK, I've been absolutely delighted by sort of folks' regional names for the people who live in a region.
It is kind of fascinating, isn't it?
So London, Londoners, fine. Birmingham, Brummies.
So I was about to say, why is that? That doesn't match any kind of pattern that I know.
Because it's awesome. Yeah, I think that's the official scientific historical, because it's cool.
I'll accept that. That's totally fine.
But my first weeks and months, I had to go around and just real quietly be like, what's a Scouser?
Sounds like there's a Scouse pie as well, isn't there?
Is there a Scouse pie?
There is a Scouse pie, yeah. The first time I heard the word Scouse was in reference to the Scouse pie, and I'm like, Scouse.
What is a Scouse pie?
Is that a type of meat? I don't know. I think it's like it's like a Cornish pasty for Liverpudlians.
Oh,
I don't know.
All of this has gotten very, very strange for our US listeners. We're both talking about people from different British cities and also small handheld. Oh, I'm going to get absolutely crucified for this, but
pastries.
It's like a calzone, but not, right?
I think let's just say pastry to keep it on the safe side.
I'm fairly sure, having said that, I'm going to get deported.
Also, is it pronounced calzone or calzone? I don't know.
Oh, I'm also not going to be able to enter Italy or New York again. But it is Clojurians for reasons we have not yet decided or deduced.
Yes. And to come back to it, I've just double checked. It's clojurians.net.
Oh.
And clojurians.net takes you to a little sign-up box for and this is the global Slack channel, so the global messaging board about all things Clojure, really beginner-friendly, anything from programming in any language for the first time to I've worked with a couple of programming languages before, I'd like to learn Clojure, to I'm building this massive application and I need some help about systems architecture or something. So there's an absolute wealth of experience there. And I know that even the creators of the language are actually relatively active on the channel as well, which is super, can be a little bit intimidating, but is incredibly helpful. If you have questions, you know that you're getting answers and stuff from pretty much the full breadth of the Clojure community. The last thing I would say on community is if you are from an underrepresented group and you would be interested in sort of getting involved in a workshop. So maybe you've read up a little bit about Clojure, but you're a little bit nervous, not entirely sure where to start. There is a group called, or it's a charity, I believe, called Clojure Bridge. So it's the full word Clojure and then followed by Bridge. And they run free, usually day-long workshops, completely beginner-friendly around the world. So there are chapters in the UK and London, to the US, to Brazil, completely global organisation. And they run free, beginner-friendly, open Clojure workshops.
You had me at free.
I'm usually so bad beginner friendly. Like, is everything
I
nice?
see.
But I can absolutely highly recommend those. The Clojure Bridge workshops are one of my first experiences of the Clojure community, and I can absolutely advocate for a really kind of friendly and welcoming community there. And they work really, really hard to make these events as accessible as possible. If you have any questions about the accessibility of each of these workshops, please go on to clojurebridge.org, and you should see all of the events and for all of the chapters there, and contact emails and stuff to contacts to get involved, to get in touch
I've got to start warning podcast guests that I'm just going to make them rattle off the URLs of every resource they ever enjoyed.
Well, I don't know if it's, stop me or cut it out if it's not helpful, but I thought...
No, you're fine. No. No, it's absolutely fantastic.
I suppose Clojure is such a weird word, isn't it? Because we're used to spelling it with an S. So I just thought I'd clarify that. I was saying, oh yeah, Clojure this, Clojure that. And it's like, do I need closure? It's not that kind of closure.
I mean, like, you could probably find some sort of closure through Clojure. Let's stop.
Use that as the new tagline.
Clojure through Clojure. I was talking to somebody about this recently, and I was talking about how in the early days of the web especially, we had this idea, we were really working from this publishing mindset that you're a bit younger than me, I think.
Possibly.
Do you remember websites that had the... That was so diplomatic. Do you remember the websites that had like the little in construction GIF at the bottom? Oh my God, you're going to say no.
No, I don't. I'm going to Google it.
A long, long time ago.
But hang on. I remember seeing like under construction, like the words on a page, but I don't think I've ever seen an in construction.
You've never seen the little orange diggy guy?
No, I've just Googled it.
I am fairly sure I put one on my first website in 1997.
It's amazing.
Oh no. It's just me and everyone else in their 30s and above going, oh no.
I'm so sorry. Disclaimer. The younger end of the millennial generation.
It is all okay. You'll inherit this all. You'll be able to say like, oh, back in my day, I remember when you used CIs. Like,
oh, don't. Do you know, I was trying to talk to my 16-year-old cousin about tapes the other day, and she was like, what do you need tapes for? Like VHS? Like a VHS? Oh no. So it's okay. It's okay. I'm here with you.
As long as everyone has that one where it's like, oh no. But I was thinking about how when the web first started, when big normal people, well, still folks who could get access to a computer and get access to the internet was slow and it kind of sucked and it was beautiful. It was bonkers. And we had this overarching mindset that you would at one point finish your website. Like these little under construction things were just like, oh, excuse the mess. One day I'll finish this and this will be a finished document. Yeah, I love the idea that even though the web didn't give us closure, maybe functional programming, the pure, firm grip on mathematical certainty, unless you import uncertainty, maybe we will indeed see closure through Clojure.
Let's hope so. That was such a good segue. I was like, where are we going with these construction gifts? Oh, Clojure. Wow, that was really cool.
So you're absolutely guaranteeing us that we will seek mathematical perfection and closure and total oneness with programming through Clojure, if I understand correctly.
Can I put an asterisk on the end?
Okay.
And say yes.
You're like, yes, with undisclosed and to be decided later addendums.
Terms and conditions apply, totally.
Terms and conditions apply.
What I can say about Clojure is that the constraints and the patterns that you have in a functional programming language like Clojure, combined with it's interesting when you first look at it, but eventually very simple kind of syntax means that it's an amazingly fun programming language to work with. You have very little, some other programming languages that I've worked with in the past, there's very little in the way of, what can I call it, almost like boilerplate or overhead in terms of things that you need to get set up. There's very little in the way of that, so that you can usually just get straight started and you can start building whether it's the smallest function or start building like the basics of an application, or use someone else's library where they've built the basics of an application. You can build off that and you can start building your own website from the first week or the first few attempts of getting involved in Clojure. It's really, really very simple compared to a lot of the other programming languages that I've worked with before. And I don't mean that in terms of, it's simple and you should all be able to get used to it like straight away, because
thank you for not doing that. Like you're nicer than that.
Everyone's learning journey is different, so I don't mean that it's simple in that sense, but I think structurally and compared to different programming languages in terms of the constructs that are being used and in terms of the makeup of the language, you might find that there's a lot less stuff to get tripped up on. It has a few rules, and those rules stay pretty consistent throughout the programming journey as you get more and more advanced. So it's just, it's really, really nice to work with. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's really it's a really elegant language, but it's also really powerful in that you have a very simple and small set of rules that you can really do a lot with and you can build entire applications with.
I think you've given us a lot to work from. You've got a simple programming language. You've got elegant code, lots of math, homework if you want it, and maybe terms and conditions apply. Total inner peace. Abby, you've been an absolutely fantastic guest. If folks wanted to find you on the internet or see more about what you're writing and doing, where do you live online?
Mostly on Twitter, retweeting really witty things that other people have thought up. So my Twitter handle is Sassel, because my surname is Sassel and my first name is A, and I'm uncreative. So that's spelled S for sugar, A-S-S-E-L-A. Follow me on Twitter. I'll almost certainly follow you back, and feel free to drop me a DM with any questions you might have about getting started with programming, getting started as a software engineer, getting started studying. I have some stories to tell about software engineering or rather computer science as a choice at university, or studying it, or having the process of learning how to be a software engineer. Or any other programming or related questions, get in touch.
Fantastic. We may have to have you back sometime to cover some of that.
Oh, please do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for listening. If you join us again next Tuesday, we're going to have a brand new episode for you. As always, if you want to see the show notes, which are glorious illustrations of this episode, you can find them on Twitter at @PursuitPod.